Sarah Martinez had always been different. Growing up in the small town of Cedar Falls, Iowa, she was the girl who preferred reading military history books to romance novels, who could name every aircraft carrier in the U.S. Navy fleet, and who dreamed of serving her country when other girls her age were planning their weddings. At 22, she stood barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, with dark brown eyes that held a determination that often surprised people who underestimated her based on her petite frame. The tattoo on her right forearm had been there for 3 years now. It wasn't flashy or decorative like the butterflies and flowers that adorned many of her female colleagues' skin. Instead, it was a simple but powerful image, a Navy SEAL trident surrounded by the words "In honor of the fallen" with a date underneath, June 15, 2018. Most people who saw it assumed it was just another military-themed tattoo, the kind that had become popular among civilians who wanted to show support for the troops. They had no idea of the story behind it, the pain that drove her to get it, or the promise it represented. Sarah worked at Pinnacle Tech Solutions, a mid-sized software company in downtown Chicago where she had moved after college. The company prided itself on its young, dynamic workforce, and the office buzzed with the energy of ambitious 20-somethings climbing their way up the corporate ladder. The open-plan office space was filled with standing desks, bean-bag chairs, and motivational posters that proclaimed things like "Think outside the box" and "Innovation never sleeps." Her colleagues were typical of their generation, educated, driven, and often more concerned with their social media presence than with anything happening outside their immediate sphere. They talked about weekend trips to wine country, the latest Netflix series, and their fitness routines with the same passion that Sarah reserved for discussions about foreign policy and military strategy. Not that anyone at work wanted to discuss those topics with her. "There goes Sarah with her war stories again," Jake Hoffman would mutter whenever she tried to contribute to conversations about current events. Jake was the office golden boy, Harvard MBA, designer suits, and the kind of confident smile that had charmed his way through every promotion he'd received. He had never served in the military, never even considered it, but he had strong opinions about defense spending and foreign policy that he'd gleaned from cable news and opinion podcasts. "I don't understand why she's so obsessed with the military," whispered Amanda Chen to her desk neighbor during their lunch break. "It's like she thinks she's some kind of expert just because she has that tattoo." Amanda was the office social coordinator, the one who planned happy hours and birthday celebrations. She wore her blonde hair in perfect waves and had a tattoo of a quote about following your dreams in elegant script along her collarbone. The irony that she was criticizing someone else's tattoo choice was lost on her. The mockery had started subtly. When Sarah would mention reading about military operations or defense policy, her colleagues would exchange glances and change the subject. When she wore short sleeves that revealed her tattoo, she'd catch people pointing and whispering. The comments gradually became more direct. "Nice ink, Sarah," Derek Williams had said one morning, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Let me guess, you're one of those military groupies, right? Never served but loves to play dress up?" Derek was the office comedian, always ready with a quip or observation that would get laughs from the crowd. His own tattoos were a collection of pop culture references and inside jokes that required explanation to anyone over 30. Sarah had felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and anger, but she'd simply rolled down her sleeve and returned to her work. She'd learned early in her time at Pinnacle that defending herself only made the situation worse. Her colleagues had already decided what kind of person she was, and nothing she said would change their minds. The worst part wasn't the comments or the eye rolls when she spoke up during meetings. It was the complete dismissal of her knowledge and insights. Sarah had spent years studying military history, strategy, and operations. She understood geopolitical complexities that her colleagues couldn't even pronounce correctly. But, because she was young, female, and had never worn a uniform herself, her opinions were treated as worthless fantasies. "Sarah thinks she knows everything about the military because she watches war movies," Marcus Rodriguez had joked during a team meeting when she tried to explain why a particular defense contract in the news was significant. Marcus was the senior developer, respected for his coding skills but known for his sharp tongue and inability to take anyone seriously who didn't share his technical background. The isolation was beginning to wear on her. Sarah found herself eating lunch alone, avoiding the break room when her colleagues gathered there, and keeping her sleeves rolled down even on the hottest summer days. She'd started questioning whether she belonged in this environment, whether she should just find another job where people wouldn't judge her so harshly for her interests and beliefs. But every morning when she looked at her tattoo in the mirror, she remembered why she couldn't give up so easily. The date inked into her skin represented more than just a moment in time. It represented a promise, a commitment, and a debt that she could never fully repay. Her apartment was a shrine to military history. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with biographies of military leaders, accounts of famous battles, and analyses of military strategy. Framed photographs showed various military units and operations, though most people assumed they were just generic stock photos she'd found online. On her desk sat a small American flag and a single dog tag that she'd never explained to anyone who'd seen it. Sarah's weekends were often spent at veteran events around the city. She volunteered at VA hospitals, helped organize charity runs for wounded warriors, and attended memorial services for fallen soldiers. These were the places where her knowledge was respected, where her passion was understood, and where her tattoo was seen as a mark of honor rather than a fashion statement. At these events, she met real veterans, men and women who had served their country with distinction. They didn't mock her interest in military affairs or dismiss her opinions because of her age or civilian status. Instead, they appreciated her dedication to understanding and honoring military service. Many of them had stories about friends they'd lost, battles they'd fought, and sacrifices they'd made that the general public would never fully comprehend. "You remind me of my sister," an older Marine veteran had told her at a Memorial Day ceremony the previous year. "She always wanted to serve but couldn't because of a medical condition. She studied military history like it was her religion, and she knew more about tactics and strategy than most of the officers I served under." The validation from someone who had actually been there, who had seen combat and understood its realities, meant more to Sarah than all the dismissive comments from her co-workers combined. But Monday always came, and, with it, the return to Pinnacle Tech Solutions and the subtle hostility that had become her daily routine. She'd learned to navigate the office politics, to keep her head down and do her job well enough to avoid any professional criticism. Her work performance was excellent, she was reliable, creative, and dedicated. But her social standing in the office remained firmly at the bottom of the hierarchy. The company culture at Pinnacle was built around conformity disguised as innovation. Everyone was expected to think the same way, like the same things, and share the same values. Diversity was celebrated in terms of race and gender, but diversity of thought or interest was subtly discouraged. Sarah's military fascination marked her as an outsider, someone who didn't quite fit the carefully crafted image of what a Pinnacle employee should be. "Why don't you ever come to happy hour?" Lisa Park had asked her once, though the question felt more like an accusation than an invitation. Lisa was in HR and prided herself on knowing everyone's business. "You're always rushing off after work. What's so important that you can't spend time with your colleagues?" Sarah had mumbled something about prior commitments, not bothering to explain that she was usually heading to veteran support meetings or military history lectures at the local college. These weren't activities that her colleagues would understand or appreciate, so there was no point in trying to explain them. The truth was that Sarah felt more comfortable around veterans and military personnel than she did around her own co-workers. In those circles, her knowledge was valued, her opinions were heard, and her tattoo was understood. She didn't have to hide who she was or pretend to be interested in reality TV shows and celebrity gossip. Her cubicle was deliberately sparse, decorated only with a small cactus and a coffee mug with the company logo. She'd learned not to display anything that might invite questions or comments about her interests. The one time she'd brought in a book about World War II strategy, Derek had made jokes about it for a week, calling her General Sarah and asking if she was planning to invade the accounting department. The constant mockery was taking its toll on her mental health. Sarah found herself second-guessing every comment she made, every outfit she wore, every book she carried. She'd started having anxiety dreams about work, scenarios where her colleagues discovered something else about her to ridicule. The stress was affecting her sleep, her appetite, and her overall enjoyment of life. Her family back in Iowa knew she was struggling, though they didn't fully understand why. During their weekly phone calls, her mother would ask if she'd made any friends at work, if she was dating anyone, if she was happy with her life in Chicago. Sarah would give vague, positive answers that masked the reality of her daily experience. "You sound tired, honey," her father had said during their last conversation. "Is everything okay at work?" Her father was a veteran himself, having served in the army during the Gulf War, and he understood her respect for military service. But he also worried that her obsession with military history was keeping her from building a normal social life. Sarah couldn't explain to him that her interest in military affairs wasn't just a hobby or obsession. It was a connection to something larger than herself, a way of honoring people who had given everything for their country. Her tattoo wasn't a fashion statement or an attempt to look tough. It was a memorial, a promise, and a daily reminder of what real sacrifice looked like. As the months passed, the isolation at work became more pronounced. Sarah found herself eating lunch in her car, taking breaks alone on the building's roof deck, and leaving the office as quickly as possible each day. She'd stopped trying to contribute to conversations or build relationships with her colleagues. It was easier to be invisible than to endure their mockery and dismissal. But invisibility came with its own problems. During performance reviews, her manager noted that she seemed disconnected from the team and not fully engaged with company culture. The irony that her disconnection was a direct result of her colleagues' treatment wasn't lost on her, but it wasn't something she could address without seeming like she was making excuses or playing the victim. The situation reached a turning point on a particularly difficult Thursday in late October. Sarah had made the mistake of wearing a sleeveless blouse to work, forgetting that it would expose her tattoo to the usual scrutiny and comments. By lunchtime, she'd already endured 3 separate instances of mockery and one particularly cruel joke about stolen valor from Jake, who seemed to think that having a military tattoo as a civilian was somehow fraudulent. "I bet she got that tattoo because she thought it would make her look tough," Amanda had whispered loudly enough for Sarah to hear as she passed by the break room. Like those girls who wear band t-shirts for bands they'd never actually listened to. "It's all for show." The comparison stung more than Amanda could have known. Sarah's tattoo wasn't for show, wasn't a fashion statement, and wasn't an attempt to appropriate military culture. It was deeply personal, meaningful, and sacred to her in ways that her colleagues would never understand. But their casual dismissal of it as superficial posturing felt like a violation of everything it represented. That evening, as Sarah sat in her apartment looking at the photographs and memorabilia that filled her living space, she made a decision. She couldn't change her colleagues' attitudes or make them understand her passion for military history. But she also couldn't continue to hide who she was or apologize for her interests and values. Tomorrow, she decided, she would wear her tattoo proudly and let her colleagues think whatever they wanted. She was tired of living in shame for honoring something she believed in. Whatever consequences came from that decision, she would face them with the same courage that had inspired her tattoo in the first place. Little did she know that tomorrow would bring an encounter that would change not just her life, but the entire dynamic of her workplace. Sometimes the most profound moments come when we least expect them, and sometimes the people who seem furthest from our world turn out to be closer than we ever imagined. Friday morning arrived gray and drizzling, typical Chicago autumn weather that matched Sarah's mood as she prepared for another day at Pinnacle Tech Solutions. She stood in front of her bathroom mirror, staring at her reflection and the tattoo that had become both a source of strength and a target for ridicule. Today felt different, though. Today she was determined to stop hiding. She selected a navy blue sleeveless blouse from her closet, one that would clearly display her tattoo throughout the day. As she got dressed, Sarah's mind wandered to the memorial service she'd attended the previous weekend. A young soldier from Illinois had been killed in action overseas, and she joined hundreds of others in honoring his sacrifice. Moments like those reminded her why her tattoo mattered, why the mockery of her colleagues was insignificant compared to the real meaning behind the ink on her arm. The commute to downtown Chicago felt longer than usual, probably because she was dreading the inevitable comments and stares that would greet her exposed tattoo. But she was tired of hiding, tired of rolling down her sleeves and apologizing for who she was. If her colleagues wanted to judge her, let them. She knew the truth behind her choices, and that was what mattered. Pinnacle Tech Solutions occupied 3 floors of a gleaming glass tower in the heart of the business district. The lobby was all marble and chrome, designed to impress clients and intimidate competitors. Sarah badged in through the security turnstiles and rode the elevator to the 15th floor, steeling herself for whatever the day might bring. She wasn't disappointed. Within 10 minutes of settling at her desk, she'd already caught 3 colleagues staring at her tattoo and whispering to each other. Jake Hoffman made his usual dramatic entrance at 9:30, coffee in hand and designer suit perfectly pressed, and immediately zeroed in on Sarah's exposed arm. Well, he announced loudly enough for half the office to hear, "Looks like someone's feeling extra patriotic today. Did you forget to wear sleeves, Sarah, or are you trying to make some kind of statement?" Sarah looked up from her computer screen, meeting his gaze directly instead of looking away as she usually did. "I'm not making any statement, Jake. I'm just wearing what I want to wear." "Right," Jake smirked, walking closer to her cubicle. "That's quite the piece of artwork you've got there. Very authentic looking. Did you spend a lot of time researching military tattoos online before you got it done?" The implication that her tattoo was some kind of costume piece stung, but Sarah forced herself to remain calm. "I didn't research anything, Jake. It means something to me." "Oh, I'm sure it does," Derek Williams chimed in from across the aisle, abandoning his own work to join the growing audience around Sarah's desk. "Let me guess, you've got a brother or cousin in the military? Or maybe you just really loved Top Gun?" The laughter that rippled through the nearby cubicles felt like salt in an open wound. Sarah's hands clenched into fists under her desk, but she kept her voice steady. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Come on, Sarah," Amanda Chen called out from her desk, "we're just curious. You've never talked about having family in the military. So what's the story? Did you lose a bet or something?" More laughter. Sarah felt heat rising in her cheeks as more colleagues gathered around, drawn by the commotion like sharks sensing blood in the water. She realized she was about to become the center of attention in exactly the way she'd always tried to avoid. "Maybe she thinks it makes her look tough," suggested Marcus Rodriguez, leaning back in his chair with his arms crossed. "Like those people who get barbed wire tattoos or Chinese characters they can't even read." "Or maybe," Jake said with theatrical deliberation, "she's one of those military groupies we read about. You know, the ones who hang around bases trying to pick up soldiers." "Is that it, Sarah? Is this some kind of calling card?" The accusation was so far from the truth that it took Sarah's breath away. She stood up from her chair, her face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "You have no idea what you're talking about. None of you do." "Then, enlighten us," Derek challenged, his tone mocking. "Tell us the deep, meaningful story behind your Navy SEAL tattoo. We're all dying to hear it." Sarah looked around at the circle of faces surrounding her cubicle. Some were amused, some were curious, but all of them were looking at her like she was some kind of entertainment. These were people she worked with every day, people who saw her as nothing more than an object of ridicule. "The story," she said quietly, "is none of your business." "Oh, come on," Amanda pressed, "don't be like that. We're your colleagues. We're just trying to understand why someone who's never served would get such a serious military tattoo. It seems kind of inappropriate." The word inappropriate hit Sarah like a physical blow. Her tattoo wasn't inappropriate. It was sacred. It was personal. It was a promise she'd made to someone who could no longer speak for himself. But, looking at the expectant faces around her, she realized that no explanation would satisfy them. They'd already decided what kind of person she was. "I don't owe you an explanation," she said, sitting back down and turning toward her computer. But Jake wasn't ready to let it go. "Actually, you kind of do. I mean, if you're going to wear something that provocative to work, you should expect people to ask questions. It's not like getting a butterfly tattoo, Sarah. You're wearing military insignia that other people earned through blood, sweat, and sacrifice. Don't you think that's a little presumptuous?" The accusation of presumption was the final straw. Sarah spun around in her chair, her voice rising despite her best efforts to stay calm. "Presumptuous? You want to talk about presumptuous? You sit here in your expensive suits, making jokes about things you don't understand, judging people based on appearances, and you think I'm the one who's presumptuous? Whoa, calm down there, General, Derek said with a grin. We're just having a conversation. No need to go nuclear on us. That's exactly my point, Sarah shot back. You think this is all a joke? You think military service is something to make puns about? You have no idea what real sacrifice looks like. And, you do? Jake challenged. Based on what? A tattoo you got at some strip mall parlor? The insult was designed to hurt, and it succeeded. Sarah felt tears threatening behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall in front of these people. She was saved from having to respond by the arrival of Lisa Park from HR, who had apparently heard the raised voices from her office. Is everything okay over here? Lisa asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. I could hear voices from down the hall. Just a friendly discussion about Sarah's interesting tattoo choice, Jake said with false innocence. We were curious about the story behind it. Lisa looked at Sarah, who was clearly upset, then, at the group of colleagues still gathered around her cubicle. I think everyone should probably get back to work now. Sarah, could I see you in my office for a moment? The walk to Lisa's office felt like a march to execution. Sarah knew how these conversations typically went. The person being harassed would be told to try to fit in better, while the harassers would receive a gentle suggestion to be more inclusive. Nothing would really change, and she'd be marked as a troublemaker for causing drama. Lisa's office was decorated with motivational posters and family photos, the kind of corporate-friendly environment designed to make employees feel comfortable while discussing uncomfortable topics. She gestured for Sarah to sit in the chair across from her desk and closed the door behind them. So, Lisa began, settling into her own chair. That seemed like a pretty heated conversation out there. Do you want to tell me what happened? Sarah stared at her hands folded in her lap. Jake and Derek were making comments about my tattoo. It escalated. I see. Lisa made a note on her pad. And how did it escalate exactly? The question put Sarah in an impossible position. If she detailed the comments and jokes her colleagues had made, she'd sound like she was whining about every small slight. If she downplayed the situation, nothing would change. Either way, she'd be labeled as the problem. They called it inappropriate, Sarah said finally. They suggested I was pretending to be something I'm not. Well, Lisa said carefully, I can see how that would be upsetting. But, you have to understand that military-themed tattoos can be sensitive topics in the workplace. Some people might feel that wearing such imagery could be seen as. She paused, searching for the right words, potentially controversial. Sarah looked up sharply. Controversial? Supporting our military is controversial? Not supporting the military, Lisa clarified quickly, but displaying military insignia when you haven't served yourself might make some people uncomfortable. It's a complex issue. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah that she was being counseled for having a military tattoo by someone whose own tattoo proclaimed her dedication to following dreams. But she bit back her response and simply nodded. Look, Lisa continued, I'm going to talk to Jake and Derek about keeping their comments professional. But maybe you could consider wearing longer sleeves to work? Just to avoid any future misunderstandings? There it was. The suggestion that she hide herself to make others comfortable. Sarah had expected it, but it still hurt to hear it stated so directly. She was the one being asked to change, not the people who were creating the hostile environment. I understand, Sarah said quietly. Good. I'm glad we could resolve this quietly. You're a valuable employee, Sarah, and I'd hate to see personality conflicts affect your career here. The threat was subtle but clear. Play along and keep quiet, or face consequences for being a disruptive influence. Sarah left the HR office feeling more isolated than ever. Not only were her colleagues against her, but now the company itself was making it clear whose side they were on. The rest of the day passed in uncomfortable silence. Word had apparently spread about the morning's confrontation, and Sarah found herself the subject of whispered conversations and pointed stares throughout the office. Some colleagues seemed embarrassed by what had happened, but none of them approached her to offer support or apologize for their colleagues' behavior. During lunch, Sarah sat alone in the building's lobby, watching businesspeople hurry past with their important meetings and urgent deadlines. She wondered if she was making a mistake by staying at Pinnacle, if there was some other company where she might fit in better. But, the rational part of her mind knew that the problem wasn't unique to this workplace. In her experience, most corporate environments were hostile to anything that didn't fit their narrow definition of appropriate interests and values. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her father. "Hope you're having a good day, sweetheart. Remember that we're proud of you no matter what." The timing felt like divine intervention. Her family was hundreds of miles away, but they still understood her better than the people she saw every day. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah threw herself into her work, trying to lose herself in code and spreadsheets. She was good at her job, efficient and creative, and she took pride in her professional competence even if her social standing was non-existent. At least in the realm of actual work performance, her colleagues couldn't find fault with her. But, the morning's events had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. The casual cruelty of her colleagues' comments, the assumption that her tattoo was some kind of costume piece, the suggestion that she was being inappropriate by honoring military service, it all felt like an attack on her core values and identity. At 5 o'clock, Sarah gathered her things and prepared to leave the office. As she waited for the elevator, she overheard Jake talking to Derek near the reception desk. "I still think there's more to that tattoo story than she's letting on," Jake was saying. "People don't just randomly decide to get Navy SEAL ink. There's got to be some drama there." "Maybe she's making the whole thing up," Derek replied. "Like, maybe she just thought it looked cool and now she's stuck with this elaborate backstory she has to maintain." Sarah stepped into the elevator and let the doors close behind her, cutting off their speculation. As the elevator descended toward the lobby, she caught her reflection in the polished metal doors. Her tattoo was clearly visible, the trident and anchor design standing out starkly against her skin. She traced the words "in honor of the fallen" with her fingertip and whispered a promise that only she could hear. Tomorrow would be different, she decided. Tomorrow she would find a way to make them understand. She wasn't sure how yet, but she couldn't continue to let their ignorance and mockery define her experience. There had to be a way to bridge the gap between her world and theirs, some way to make them see that her tattoo represented something bigger and more important than their small-minded assumptions. What she didn't know was that tomorrow would indeed be different, but not in any way she could have imagined. Sometimes the universe has a way of intervening just when things seem most hopeless, and sometimes the people who can change everything are closer than we think. Monday morning arrived with an unexpected twist that would forever change the dynamic at Pinnacle Tech Solutions. As Sarah walked through the lobby, she noticed unusual activity around the reception desk. Men and women in crisp business suits were checking in with security, their posture and bearing distinctly different from the usual tech workers who populated the building. There was something unmistakably military about the way they carried themselves, an alertness and precision that caught Sarah's attention immediately. "Looks like we've got some kind of corporate visitors today," she overheard one of the security guards saying to another. "Big meeting upstairs with the C-suite. Something about a government contract." Sarah's curiosity was piqued, but she had her own problems to worry about. After Friday's confrontation and the weekend to think about it, she decided to continue wearing short sleeves and displaying her tattoo proudly. If her colleagues wanted to make an issue of it, so be it. She was tired of hiding who she was to make other people comfortable. The morning passed relatively quietly. Her colleagues seemed to be giving her a wide berth after Friday's incident, which was fine with Sarah. She preferred their distance to their mockery, even if the isolation was sometimes difficult to bear. Around 10:30, however, the normal office routine was interrupted by an announcement over the building's PA system. "Attention all Pinnacle Tech Solutions employees," came the voice of their CEO, Robert Chen. "We have some very important visitors in the building today who will be touring our facilities and meeting with various departments. Please extend them every courtesy and represent our company well." Sarah looked up from her computer as whispers rippled through the office. Government contracts were rare but lucrative for tech companies, and the possibility of landing a major federal deal had everyone excited. She watched as her colleagues began straightening their desks and checking their appearance. Suddenly, conscious that they might be observed by important outsiders. Around 11:15, the visitors began their tour of the 15th floor. Sarah could see them approaching through the glass walls of the conference room, led by Robert Chen and several other executives. What caught her attention immediately was the bearing and appearance of the lead visitor, a tall man with salt and pepper hair, probably in his early 40s, who moved with the kind of controlled precision that spoke of military training. He was dressed in an expensive navy suit, but everything about his posture and demeanor screamed military officer. As the group drew closer, Sarah could see that he had the kind of weathered features that came from years of exposure to harsh conditions, and his eyes had the alert, assessing quality of someone accustomed to evaluating threats and opportunities in split seconds. "That must be the government liaison," Amanda whispered to Derek, both of them craning their necks to get a better look at the visitors. "He looks pretty serious." Jake, never one to miss an opportunity for attention, had positioned himself strategically near the main walkway where the tour group would pass. He straightened his tie and put on his most professional smile, clearly hoping to make an impression on the important visitors. As the group approached their section of the office, Sarah noticed something that made her heart race. The lead visitor's gaze was methodically scanning the workspace, taking in details with the thoroughness of someone conducting a tactical assessment. When his eyes fell on her, they stopped. More specifically, they stopped on her tattoo. For a moment, the man's professional composure seemed to waver. His eyes widened slightly, and he took a step closer to Sarah's cubicle, studying her tattoo with an intensity that made her self-conscious. The rest of the tour group continued walking, but he lingered, his gaze fixed on the trident and anchor design on her forearm. "Excuse me," he said quietly, approaching her desk. His voice carried the kind of authority that made everyone in the immediate area stop what they were doing and pay attention. "That's an interesting tattoo you have there." Sarah felt her cheeks burning as she became the center of attention once again. She was acutely aware that her colleagues were watching, probably preparing to enjoy another round of her humiliation. But something in the man's tone was different from what she'd experienced before. There was no mockery, no dismissive amusement. Instead, there was something that looked almost like recognition. "Thank you," she managed to say, unsure how else to respond. The man stepped closer, and now Sarah could see that his eyes weren't just alert, they were kind. More importantly, they held a depth of understanding that she'd only seen in one place before, at veteran gatherings and military memorials. "In honor of the fallen," he read quietly, studying the words beneath the trident. "June 15, 2018. He looked up at her face, and there was something in his expression that made Sarah's breath catch. That was Operation Neptune's Spear, wasn't it? The question hit Sarah like a physical blow. Operation Neptune's Spear wasn't widely known outside military circles. It had been a classified SEAL operation in Afghanistan that had gone tragically wrong, resulting in the deaths of 4 team members. The fact that this stranger knew not only the operation name but could connect it to the specific date on her tattoo meant only one thing. "You know about it," she whispered, her voice barely audible. By now, the man's delay had caused the rest of the tour group to stop and return. Robert Chen looked slightly concerned about the deviation from their planned schedule, but he didn't dare interrupt what was clearly an important moment. Sarah's colleagues were also watching intently, confused by the sudden gravity of the conversation. "I know about it because I was there," the man said simply. "I was the commanding officer for that operation." The words seemed to echo in the sudden silence that fell over the office. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face as she stared at the man who had just revealed himself to be not just any military officer, but the leader of the very mission commemorated by her tattoo. "You're Commander Mitchell," she said, the words coming out as a statement rather than a question. "I am," he confirmed. "Though it's Admiral Mitchell now." "And you are?" "Sarah Martinez," she replied, her voice shaking slightly. Admiral Mitchell nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving her tattoo. "Ms. Martinez, I have to ask, why do you have the date of one of my operations tattooed on your arm?" That was a classified mission. Very few people outside the teams knew the details. Sarah was aware that her colleagues were hanging on every word of this exchange, their earlier mockery forgotten in the face of this unexpected revelation. Jake's confident smile had faded into confusion, while Amanda and Derek looked like they'd been caught gossiping about their boss. Because, Sarah said, fighting back tears, my brother was on that mission. The words fell into the silence like stones into still water, creating ripples of understanding that spread through the watching crowd. Admiral Mitchell's expression shifted from professional curiosity to something deeper, more personal. He studied Sarah's face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a critical puzzle. Your brother, he repeated quietly. What was his name? Staff Sergeant Miguel Martinez, Sarah replied, her voice stronger now. He was the team's communications specialist. Admiral Mitchell closed his eyes for a moment, and, when he opened them again, they were filled with emotion. Miguel. My God. You're Miguel's sister. The recognition in his voice transformed the entire atmosphere of the office. This was no longer a casual conversation between strangers, it was a reunion of sorts, a connection between people who shared a profound loss. He talked about you all the time, Admiral Mitchell continued, his professional composure giving way to genuine emotion. His little sister who knew more about military history than most of his instructors. He was so proud of you. Sarah felt tears spilling down her cheeks now, not caring that her colleagues were witnessing this intensely personal moment. He talked about you too. He said you were the best commanding officer he'd ever served under. He trusted you completely. And, I failed him, Admiral Mitchell said quietly, his voice heavy with the weight of command responsibility.